A shout out this week to someone named Maria, who I knew remotely several years ago. I was working on the annual report for a large company that had operations in Venezuela. As part of my work on that project, I had been interviewing managers in the company from around the world. It just so happened that on the day that I was scheduled to interview Maria, I couldn't get a hold of her by phone. Later in that day, she called me. She told me she had to call from a phone in her apartment and that she couldn't get to the office because the government had, without warning, seized the company's operations and shut them down. That gave me a chilling insight, if from afar, to what was happening in that country at that time. Later I would talk to Maria about what had happened, and here's what she said to me. She said that socialism isn't like saying you get to keep what you have to enjoy life the way you do now, only it gets better. She said it's the opposite of that. Socialism is about sacrifice, giving up what you have now for the promise of something that can only benefit a few, and those few are usually the ones who are in power. I tell you this story because it may help frame things for what you will hear today. We're going to hear from someone who grew up under socialism in Venezuela until he could escape to the United States in 2016. He's young. He's a recent college graduate, but his life has given him an education like none other. After you listen to this episode, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please send me an email to tim@shapingopinion.com. If it's easier for you, get in touch on Twitter or Instagram @shapingopinion. And if you want, we can give you a shout out. As always, thank you for being a listener of the Shaping Opinion podcast. You're the reason we do this. This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Daniel, when you first came to America, what was the first thing that you noticed that you didn't have back in Venezuela?
There were two. The first one was safety. I could walk in the street and not fear for my life. Caracas, where I lived, is the city with the highest murder rate in the world. So if you walk alone in the street, no matter what time of the day, it's always a constant concern over whether someone will come and kill you, kidnap you, rob you. And that's not a concern in the United States. And the second one was just being able to buy what I want whenever I want, and not being concerned that I need to hoard things because there won't be cereal or there won't be milk or there won't be beef next day in the supermarket, right? And that's, it calms you and it makes you live more peacefully.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Daniel Martino. He's a Venezuelan freedom activist who was born and raised in Venezuela, where he lived under socialism until he fled the country for the United States in 2016. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. In this episode, Daniel will explain socialism's impact on his homeland's economy, quality of life, individual freedoms, and how it affected the future for the millennial generation of that country. Not that long ago, Venezuela was one of the wealthiest countries in South America. Contrast that to today, where the country's economy and its socioeconomic structure has already crumbled. Millions have fled the country in the midst of mass starvation and violence. As hard times took hold, the government enforced a broad range of socialist policies, creating food and medicine shortages, destroying educational and health systems, seizing private industry, and taking away individual freedoms and rights from the people. But how did it get this way? It started in 1992. That's when a Venezuelan army officer named Hugo Chavez led several army units in a coup against the government. His initial coup attempt was defeated after over 100 people were killed in the uprising. To appease the opposition, the government released Chavez from prison after 2 years. Not long after that, Chavez became the leader of the opposition movement under the banner of socialism. He went to Cuba and formed an alliance with Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. 4 years later, he ran for the Venezuelan presidency. He downplayed his radicalism, telling voters that he was not for, quote, savage capitalism, nor socialism, nor communism. At the time, he described his philosophy as a balance between socialism and capitalism. Using this softer rhetoric, he won the election. At first, Chavez did not implement many socialist policies. What he did was rewrite the Constitution. He told Venezuela's Congress in 1999, quote, "The Constitution, and with it the ill-fated political system to which it gave birth 40 years ago, has to die. It's going to die, sirs. Accept it." End quote. After that, Chavez did rewrite the Constitution, and that led to government-run healthcare and government-run college, and he won 72% of the vote. While the Constitution was similar to the one in the United States, Chavez was able to stack his country's Supreme Court by passing a law that added 12 new justices to the court. This assured that any court case would go his way. Once Chavez had control of the courts and then the legislature, he began to more fully implement his socialist policies. By 2006, Chavez ran for election as a socialist, and once he won, he began to more fully seize privately owned property. He nationalized the news media, and by that I mean he took control over the news media in addition to the oil industry, private companies, mines, farms, banks, and grocery stores. The population became fully dependent on the government for all the needs of daily living. In 1999, the same year that Hugo Chavez decided to change Venezuela's constitution, Daniel Martino was born.
I mean, my parents are great, and I'm very lucky to have such great parents. And when I was a child, we could travel, right? We could we could do vacations, for example. On like Easter or on the summer when I went out of school. But then we just could not do that anymore. That was the first step. Then, some days in school I wouldn't have teachers because even though my school was great and I really loved them, the problem was that the teachers would just quit and leave the country, or the teachers would just dismiss class because they would find something in the supermarket down the street, so we wouldn't have class that day. And, that's not a way to educate children, right? Another big aspect of my childhood was the level of danger, right? And it became worse over time. First, we just had to be taken by our parents to like social gatherings or parties and things like that. We had to be on time and everything. Then we couldn't do parties at all at night. We had to meet at people's homes only in the afternoon while there was daylight because of how high crime was. We couldn't have a normal teenage years, right? I didn't have that experience that many Americans do because it was just not safe to do that.
You say you couldn't have a normal experience, but you didn't know any different. So when did you start to realize that this may not be normal?
Well, I had traveled before to the United States. I also, had internet access and obviously, watched TV. And that's what obviously made me see that things were different in the United States and things were different in the rest of the world. And that's what really, told me that this is not normal. It's not normal that you can't go out at night. It's not normal that you have to wait in the supermarkets to buy things. And I knew that it wasn't normal to wait in the supermarket to buy things too, because I didn't have to do that when I was, say, 12 years old. And I did have to do it when I was 13, even more when I was 14. And it got worse over time.
One of the things that I've noticed when I did my research for this episode, and we talked about the problems that Venezuela had, there were certain issues with mismanagement and falling oil prices and other things. But one of the things that I read, and the people that would explain the problems of Venezuela, they would say, well, that was because of corruption, or that was because of mismanagement in leadership, or falling oil prices affected the local economy in Venezuela because they depended so heavily on oil, or the U.S. sanctions were affecting Venezuela. And those are all the reasons why there were so many hardships on the Venezuelan people. But you had some different thoughts on that. What were your thoughts?
Well, I have two main things. One, if it was about corruption, why don't we see the rest of Latin America starving to death, right? Latin America is a very corrupt region where politicians steal, they make backroom deals, and, it's very not transparent, right? But you don't see the level of misery that you see in Venezuela. And in other oil-producing countries, when the oil prices fell, you didn't see also the economic crisis that you saw in Venezuela. In countries like Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Iran, even Iran, right? You didn't see people starving in the street and fleeing in the millions. And that's because it's not about the oil and it's not about the corruption. It's about the socialism, because that's the difference between all these countries and Venezuela. It is that Venezuela implemented price controls, took away property, increased regulations that destroyed businesses, while all those other countries didn't. I'm not condoning corruption or oil dependency. I think it's wrong, but it's not the reason for the suffering of the Venezuelan people.
Well, let's talk about your personal experience with that, because some of the things that you've written about, you've said that obviously Hugo Chavez instituted widespread nationalization of private industry, and this led to these are kind of abstract thoughts for people, price controls and currency, but they hit home when they start to affect us. How did something like price controls or nationalization of private industry affect you and your family?
The most direct way was that we owned a gas station. Once the government fully nationalized the oil industry, we wouldn't get our gasoline anymore from British Petroleum, BP. We would get it from the government oil company. And the result was that the deliveries were irregular. We wouldn't get enough gasoline to supply our customers. People started to make lines in our gas station. They still do, because there's not enough gasoline available. Other ways in which it affected me, the price control especially, was the gas station as well. Gasoline was price capped. So we couldn't increase the price of gasoline while the rest of goods were increasing in price. So our income was not increasing. And we started depending on government subsidies to live. Government subsidies that over time became smaller and smaller because inflation kept going up. So that's how our income went from thousands of dollars a month to just $2 a day by the time I left in 2016. It's almost extreme poverty.
So you're saying that your whole family had to live on $2 a day?
That's right, in 2016.
There's some irony here that Venezuela's chief export was oil, yet there was rationing of gasoline.
Oh yeah, and there still is. And now we don't produce almost any oil because the government wants to give away everything for free. So they cut back on investment in the oil industry, the maintenance of the equipment and things of that sort. And because of that, now all those equipments are just falling apart and the production fell.
Well, one of the other things that you wrote about in some of the things that you've written on this subject is you talked about the nationalization of agriculture. In other words, the government actually took land away from landowners and it gave it to what it described as poor workers. But that doesn't mean those poor workers had the resources, ability, or knowledge to work the land and to run those farms. So from 1999, the year you were born, until 2016, the year you left, the Chavez regime took 6 million acres of land away from their owners. How did that affect the food supplies and the country's economy?
Oh, we became completely dependent on food imports. We were not producing almost any of our own food. And we could still import food because we had so much oil exports right at the beginning because of the oil price boom. But that was not sustainable, right? And eventually when that boom ended, the reality was that the government had destroyed our food production capacity. We could not increase our food production because the government just owned those acres and there was no incentive to invest. I could see in the highway that was between the city where my parents worked and Caracas, so vast tracts of land that became just empty after the government took them away. And they had a huge sign that says "Made in Socialism." And it's very ironic because there's nothing there, right? Even though it says "Made in Socialism."
It makes you wonder, though, because when you have a person that's an autocrat at the very least, and that's Hugo Chavez, who takes control of a country that way, and the country clearly changes in a negative way, people might say, well, that's because of Chavez. That's not because of socialism. That's because of one man who just ruined the country. He wasn't the right person for the job. What would you say to that?
Right. We need to understand something it's about the policies, not about the person. The policies have been nationalization, have been price controls. And today, for example, Maduro has actually stopped enforcing price controls. And because he has stopped enforcing price controls, you don't see the lines of hours that you saw before, even under Maduro, who's a dictator. So that proves that it is about the policies. And if those same policies were implemented somewhere else, say in the United States, they would lead to the same result. Because it's already happened. In the 70s, there was price controls on gasoline and on other products. And you saw people lining up on gas stations in the United States. It's the same thing that happened in Venezuela on a larger scale and on more products.
One of the other things that you mentioned was that government officials, once they institute these things like price controls and there's rationing, the government officials are actually incentivized to please voters by selling products at low prices, oftentimes below cost, and the hiring of more employees than they need, so that increases costs.
Yeah, that's right. Because the government owns something, now their goal, because their goal is to get reelected, right, and stay in power and keep stealing money or whatever they want to do. How do they do this? They lower prices because that's popular with people, and they hire more people. But that's not gonna help us produce anything extra, right? All their money is coming from their magic oil reserve that's gonna end up running out, and ended up running out. And in other countries, it might not be oil, it might be tax revenue. So they'll just increase taxes on the rich. But you also cannot increase taxes on the rich over 100%, right? Or not even close, because people will just leave. So it's just like Margaret Thatcher says, right? Socialism works until you run out of other people's money. And that's what happened in Venezuela.
That's interesting. She did say that. That's a famous quote of Margaret Thatcher's, is that socialism only works when you run out of, only works until you run out of other people's money. And that is what this is dependent on. You actually gave some statistics and some things that I read. You talked about Venezuela's food production and how it fell 75% in 2 decades, while the population increased by 33%. So I did have a question. Where did you get those statistics?
So there are business associations in Venezuela, kind of like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, but the Venezuelan Chamber of Commerce. And the population figures are just publicly available through both the U.S. Census and the Venezuelan Census.
So they're verifiable.
Yeah.
Well, that leads me then to some other things, because when we look at these types of statistics and then we start looking at an economy, we look at the major sectors. And every major sector we talk about when we look at an economy was nationalized by Hugo Chavez. There was electricity, there was water, there was oil, which is their chief export. Their economy rides on the oil marketplace. Banking, and as you mentioned in some of your personal examples, supermarkets and grocery stores and construction. Every one of those sectors was nationalized. Were there any cases where nationalization actually helped any of those industries?
There was none. I can't think of any sector that was actually helped by nationalization. Milk production, there was processing of milk in several factories, and they just shut down. Other cement factories completely shut down, so we had to import cement. Absolutely everything the government touched, they destroyed. And you think, well, that perhaps Chavez and Maduro did this on purpose. But it's also not just Venezuela, the example. The same thing happened in Cuba. The same thing happened in the Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries. Same is in North Korea. Everywhere in the world, in different cultures, different geographies, everything's different times in history. The same result has happened with the same policies.
And at the root of it, it's basically this. When you take away the market dynamics, when you take away market supply and demand, and that doesn't set pricing, when government imposes the price ceilings on the products that people buy, that puts constraints on the people that deliver those products or those services. So, in other words, if I want to sell beef or milk or toilet paper, and it costs me more to get it to you than you're paying me, I just can't stay in business very long. Sooner or later, I'm going to go bankrupt. But if the government requires me to do it this way, then I'll only be able to do it as long as I can, and then I go out of business. Is that pretty much a quick summary of what happened?
That's right. Look, if you don't have that's what happens with price controls and nationalization. The government doesn't have an incentive to profit. And because they don't have an incentive to profit, they will increase cost as much as they can to increase their voters, and they will decrease revenue. On the other hand, if you impose price controls as well on private industry, then they will have no incentive to produce anything more of that thing that's controlled. Because if they can't profit from producing it, why are they going to produce it at all, right?
You know, there's one attitude, I think, among people that aren't very familiar or don't care about geopolitical issues, and that is they look at socialism and they look at the promises that people make under the auspices of socialism, and they say, well, I can have my life the way I have it right now. It'll just get better because, and we look at the United States and the issues that we see at play. People talk about, you know, universal health care, or they talk about eliminating student debt, maybe free college. All of those things are offered by some people. Now, I guess my big question is, can I have the life that I have now and it will just get better under those worlds?
If you get, if you don't pay anything into the system today and you get something for free, you might get a short-term benefit. Many people got short-term benefits in Venezuela, but once the money runs out, and the country goes into an economic crisis because there's no way to fund these programs, then those benefits are just going to disappear and you'll actually be underwater. It's going to be much worse for you. In Venezuela, the poor got poorer and the rich got poorer, right?
One of the things I did want to talk to you about today, Daniel, was welfare programs, because we talked about economic issues and how it affected pricing in business, but then there are these social programs, these things that Chavez called missions, aimed at tackling things like poverty and illiteracy and healthcare. Now, how were those things addressed? You said there was a short-term benefit, but it didn't last. But how was the government able to address certain social issues?
Well, the government addressed them also, I think, in the wrong way. They started, building homes. The government itself, it started building homes in something they called the Great Housing Mission. They called all their social welfare programs missions. And the result was that the government obviously didn't build very good quality housing. It was actually very dangerous to live in those places, not just because of crime, but also because the places were crumbling down. The infrastructure was not right because they just wanted to build as much housing as possible, no matter the quality, because they just wanted to inflate the numbers. And that's just one of the examples, right? They also wanted to give away free college for free to everybody, no matter how. And how they did that was that since there was obviously not enough space to give everybody a college education immediately in Venezuela, they created their own universities. Universities that were basically just giving away a paper certificate that said you had a bachelor's degree, but actually no good education.
The Maduro government insists that high-level education is one of its priorities, but this year the Ministry of Education's allocation did not exceed 10% of what universities requested to continue operating. Some students are now decidedly apolitical, saying they no longer identify with either political party.
We are living in oppression. If we raise our voice, they call us traitors. No one wants to go to prison. No one wants to be deprived of his or her freedom. We are seeing many injustices right now.
Last year, the heads of 11 Venezuelan universities issued a statement saying that 2019 was the most difficult economic and logistical year for universities. Meanwhile, many students are hesitant to demand more, afraid they will be jailed for expressing their discontent.
Let's just use a common situation. What if I had the need for a surgery that might not be life-threatening, but it's something that I might need in the next 2 months? Let's just say a bad shoulder or a bad knee or something like that. Or I just needed to see a doctor. How did the social missions help or hinder my health care?
Well, the government healthcare already existed before Chavez. So there were public hospitals before him, and they were not very good quality. What Chavez did was that he started building mobile hospitals inside the slums. and he brought Cuban doctors to supply them because there were not enough doctors in Venezuela to do that. And the Cuban doctors were basically slaves sent by Cuba. And it was not good quality at all. You know, people could die of diseases. It's one of the worst things. If you wanted actual care in Venezuela, you would have to go to a private clinic and have private health insurance. And it's still not guaranteed because there are not enough drugs because the government nationalized the drug industry.
Well, how did that not help, though, when Chavez brought those doctors into the poor areas? How did that not help them?
Right. If you only needed a vaccine, there wouldn't be a problem because that didn't require advanced training. But if you needed a surgery, you couldn't get it there. There was no hygiene. They had no standards, and people died in surgeries.
But was that better than what they had before?
I'm not so sure, actually. And I'm not so sure because if you get bad healthcare, is it worse than getting no healthcare, or is it better than if they had just allowed them to go to private hospitals rather than have government healthcare, which is what we had before? What Venezuela needed was not for the government to build more bad hospitals, but what they needed was free market reforms, you know, that lowered inflation, that increased purchasing power, and that allowed people to have private insurance that gave them good quality healthcare.
Now, let's suppose I was a government official. What was my healthcare like?
Well, they didn't go to government hospitals, right? They went to private clinics. Some of them went abroad. Chavez himself didn't get treated for cancer in Venezuela. He actually decided to go to Cuba and get the healthcare that Fidel Castro gets, which is also not for the one for the average Cuban, but in a special hospitals only for the elite in Cuba.
Well, you talked about the pattern of socialism around the world, and there are many case studies of socialism around the world. And oftentimes the story plays out very similarly. The people in charge have a different lifestyle, a different quality of life than the rest of the people. And that's almost not an issue about socialism. It says more about human nature, that when there are limited supplies of something, you're still going to have the haves and the have-nots.
Well, you know what? It's funny because we saw this just recently with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's a big opponent of school choice, and she doesn't like charter schools or private schools, and she doesn't want the government to guarantee that option to poor families. Yet, she was talking about recently in her own Instagram story about how she got her goddaughter to go to a charter school nearby, and she got her in her district. How is that not hypocritical that she wants poor families to go all to bad public schools, but she gets her goddaughter into a great charter school? And that's exactly what happened in Venezuela, right? You know, we had all these government-owned things that were given away for people that were bad quality, and the politicians would send, they're self-interested, and they would send their families to the best quality places that nobody else had access to.
One of the things that people do when they try to convince people, and this is something that I study as a public relations person myself, is how do you convince large numbers of people to support anything? And when I watch how people get people to support socialism, it's very interesting to me because I notice that the proponents stick to platitudes. And the worst thing that they could do is get into detail. And we actually saw that recently when Bernie Sanders was interviewed and he was asked how much one of his ideas would cost. And he used the term, I think, I don't want to nickel and dime it, but he very carefully avoided talking about the specifics of his ideas. And that is something that I know that is key to selling socialism to people, is you have to stick to the platitudes. You have to stick to the large general ideas and avoid the details, because once you get into the details, it starts to become more real on exactly how it will affect people. How have you seen certain platitudes work in the persuasion of people on socialism?
Well, I think that's right. I think that people are voting because of their gut and their emotions. They think it's not fair what many things that happen in the United States. They want some things to be cheaper, right? Housing is expensive, college is expensive, and healthcare is expensive. I think that, those of us who believe in the free enterprise system need to also appeal to those emotions. We believe in hard work. We don't believe the government needs to give away everything for free to people. And I think that's a powerful idea, especially in America. I think most Americans agree that you need to work hard to earn what you make. And if Republicans, if moderate Democrats want to defeat the socialists that are trying to take over the Democratic Party, then we need to also appeal to those emotions.
When you were in Venezuela, how was the practice of religion affected by socialism and by Hugo Chavez?
Well, Chavez, rather than being an atheist socialism, which is the commonplace application of the ideology, he actually tried to hijack religion. He put his own face in a rosary, and that was very common for many of his supporters to wear, which is just a complete desecration of Catholicism.
How was that received?
Well, those of us who opposed him didn't like it at all, right? The church completely opposed Chavez from the beginning inside the country because they knew that it was going to go bad. And it did. He persecutes priests who speak out against the government and protest. There are several famous priests. One of them is Jose Palmar from the Western state, that he's been beaten almost to death by government thugs just because he opposes the government.
What was it that finally triggered you and your family to leave Venezuela?
It was something that I had been thinking about for a long time. Chavez not only changed the country for the worse policy-wise, but he also changed the culture. Even though most people oppose him now and oppose Maduro, we need to do a lot of work in Venezuela to change that expectation that the government needs to do a lot of things that it shouldn't do. Among them, own the oil industry, right? That's something that the Venezuelans had been indoctrinated for decades because since the government started getting involved in the oil industry, that it was just government owned and the government could do whatever they wanted to everything that was below ground. And that's not normal outside Venezuela, right? Many countries have private oil industries. So I felt that I had to leave Venezuela because if I graduated from high school and then went to college in Venezuela, the best thing that I could have expected was to earn enough money to feed myself. And that was no life that I wanted to live with. And then I didn't see that change was going to happen anytime soon. And in fact, it hasn't since I left 3.5 years ago. So I thought that was the best choice for me. And I pressured my parents to do the same. After I left and when I was thinking of leaving, I was the one who pressured them, and they ended up living in Spain.
Are they happy?
They are. It just takes a lot of work, right, to start from zero. It's tough to immigrate to another country and have to start from zero, especially when you are near 50 years old without job experience because they were always just self-employed. So it's not like they could get like a letter of recommendation or that it mattered at all in a country that's actually also not in the best economic shape like Spain. So they're happy, but it just takes a lot of work to start over.
You're a research associate at the Institute for the Study of Free Enterprise at the University of Kentucky, and you have your college degree now, and you are a millennial. So if you could tell me, you're bound to have these conversations with your peers on the college campus. What kind of questions do young people have for you about your experiences?
Yeah, I actually run the reading group of the Institute. So I meet with students bi-weekly. About 25 students come to my group. And they are not all like economic students or all free marketeers. We have everything in our reading group. And they ask me a lot about it. So what they mostly ask me, is how can people survive, right, in Venezuela? And that's a very good question. One that I asked myself for a long time, too, because the situation just gets worse and worse, and you wonder how can people survive? And the reality is that now people are surviving because they are getting money from their family members abroad. And that's how they're feeding themselves through remittances.
When you talk to fellow classmates, when you talk to college students, would you say that most of them are receptive to socialism here, and how do they come at it, and do their opinions change after they talk to you?
I think a lot of them are receptive to hearing from someone who lived it in Venezuela. I think that's a very powerful story that they listen to, and that really changes their mind. It's not necessarily to voting for Trump, right? But not voting for radical socialists like Bernie Sanders, which is my goal, right? the United States will have Democrats and Republicans, for a very long time. But the idea is that nobody like Bernie Sanders ever gets elected.
Why is that?
Bernie Sanders is a Marxist. This guy supported the dictatorship in Cuba, keeps talking about the good things they did. This guy supported the dictatorship in Venezuela. He still doesn't call Maduro a dictator, or Chavez ever called him a dictator. He thinks he was a democratic leader, Hugo Chavez, when he wasn't. In Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, who's still the dictator, he supported him. All these countries abroad that he has supported socialist dictatorships, and then he comes with the same speech in America and says that he's not like those dictators, right? Even though he loved them before, even though he honeymooned in the Soviet Union, he's not like them. He's more like Denmark, he argues. But then his proposals have nothing to do like Denmark, and they have a lot more to do with Venezuela. So he's just a wolf dressed as a sheep, and this guy wants to bring about true socialism into the United States and would destroy it if he ever could.
Bernie Sanders has a large number of people in America who do believe what he says and support him. And, he makes some, as you said, some compelling arguments about the healthcare system and the expense of college. But clearly you feel that there's another way. What do you say to his supporters when you talk to them?
That there's so many bipartisan, common sense ways to lower the cost of healthcare and college education. And many of it is true. The United States has a lot of corporate power in government that shouldn't happen. But the solution is not just to take away those corporations, right? The solution is to stop corporations from influencing the government, which is a different discussion. There's lobbying, and those things are unfair, and that's not free market. That's corporate, influence of government. Free markets are about government non-intervention in favor of anyone. So I disagree with lobbying that for special interests, right? For tax breaks or things like that. Many solutions to lower the cost of healthcare would be to repeal certificate of need laws, that the government requires hospitals to go through so much of a bureaucracy just to prove that there is a need to build a new hospital. When there's always a need to build a new hospital, it will never bring anything negative. And that's just one of them. Obamacare implemented so much red tape on insurance companies and price controls that has led to a worse insurance market. Medicare, for example, supports many people who are high income. Why should the government be subsidizing the healthcare of higher income individuals as well? Why can't the government just combine all the healthcare programs, the dozens of healthcare programs it runs, into one single program that helps only the most needed Americans to buy health insurance or get healthcare? So I think that it's the same with college. There's so many regulations that increase the cost of college, such as states that require you to take classes that are not necessary for your degree, prolonging college education for degrees that perhaps you could get in 2 or 3 years rather than 4.
I did want to go back to when you talked to your fellow college students when you were a student and when you talk to college students and young people now. You have these conversations. In fact, I in a recent episode, I talked to a research scientist by the name of Hugo Mercier, and he's done studies on how to change minds in a political campaign. And one of the things he learned and found was that if you could have a canvasser who does a 10-minute conversation with a voter, they might be able to take them on an issue that they're dug in on and change their mind. But it takes a good 10 minutes or so of a give and take conversation, and that person you're talking to has to have an open mind. Now, in your case, you are doing this day in and day out. You're talking to people who might have a different opinion than you. So my question for you is, as you have these conversations by now, you probably see a pattern, and you probably know when that light goes off above their head, when you finally connected with them on an issue and they get what you're trying to say. So my question for you then is, what is that point? When you have these conversations, when is that point that you've learned to expect, oh, now they're going to get it because I'm going to tell them about this?
I think that the point is, and when I've talked to people about specific policy issues, is that when they know that the government is doing so many other things that actually make these things more expensive than they should be, and that it would be so easy to just eliminate those government regulations, a lot of people change their minds. And I even tell them, look, if we eliminate all these regulations, let's try all these things before we actually just take away the entire system, the entire industry. And if those systems were so much better, government healthcare and things like that, in many European countries, people actually buy private insurance because the government healthcare is so bad that they still have to pay for private insurance. In Spain, for example, 1 in 5 Spaniards buys private insurance despite having free government healthcare. That tells you a lot about the bad quality of that. And that's despite them having so much lower incomes because the government takes it away in taxes to pay for that bad healthcare. So I think that a lot of people, in my experience, have changed their minds when they hear facts like that. Right, it has to be people who have open minds. Other issues in which I have a good time and a good experience persuading on are price controls. A lot of people change their mind on price controls when I tell them about lines in Venezuela and how this happens and how it has even happened in the United States in the 70s, how government healthcare in the United States is terrible for veterans. So what do you expect if we expand it for the rest of the population?
Are there any particular stories from your own life that seems to change people's minds?
I think one of them is the lines that I've done in the supermarket. There's one that I tell people, and it is about, I forgot my ID once when I went to the supermarket, and the rationing system worked with your ID, so I couldn't buy anything in the supermarket that day. And that's a story that teaches you that when the government implements certain regulations, a lot of people are going to be left behind, right? Because they do things like they forget their ID. And it's for ridiculous things, right? When the government gets involved in every aspect of your life gets harder. And for me, it was with food or supermarkets. And people really, get baffled by the fact that you couldn't buy things in the supermarket because you didn't have your ID.
Well, what exactly happened that day? You went into a store, you waited in line. How long did you wait in line?
For about an hour.
And what happened?
And once I get there, with the things I needed, I think I had like some toothpaste on drugs. I was in a pharmacy. Not drugs, sorry. Some toothpaste, some like mouthwash and things like that. And I think a toothbrush. And I go there, I'm going to pay, and I have the money, it's in cash. And she tells me, okay, now I need your ID because I need to see whether you got, you're in your quota, because you could only buy so much of these things per week. When I tell, when I look for it and I didn't have it, and she's like, sorry, I can't sell it to you without checking you in the system with the ID. And she just didn't sell it to me. Yeah, that's what happened.
When were you able to go back to the store?
Well, when I had to look back for my ID, so that was a problem. So I couldn't go back that day or the next. Another time it happened to me was in a supermarket when I was with my dad. And at that time, the government was rationing through the number of your ID. So you could only go to the supermarket some days per week. And I could only do Monday and Saturdays. Same my dad, because his last number in the ID was the same as mine. So I was with him and I didn't have my ID. I couldn't buy my quota, and I had to wait until Saturday from Monday to buy it. And that was a struggle.
So you're living on $2 a day as a family, and you have to wait till certain days of the week before you can buy certain things at the grocery store in the hopes that the store has the products that you need. Were there certain days that were better than worse for certain supplies of things?
Yes, definitely. Mondays were good, but my mom couldn't buy Mondays, only my dad and I. So when I didn't get the quota Monday, it was a problem, right? Because that was the best day. If we go on Saturday, they might not have anything. And that's because usually the delivery system worked that they delivered the goods for the week on Monday morning.
I'm curious about your experience with your classmates and your peers. Are most of your friends that you knew growing up, are they still in Venezuela?
Yes.
Do you ever hear from them?
Very often. Yeah, we talk a lot. And it's not... Things are getting a little bit better now because of the remittances that are coming into the country, and because people have started to use the US dollar as a currency rather than our own. So they're protecting themselves from inflation, but a lot of people still don't have access to foreign currency.
How do you see this playing out?
I see Maduro staying in power in, the medium term. Somebody else, in the medium term might replace him, but still from the same socialist regime. And I think it's going to stabilize because of the remittances, and because people are using the U.S. dollar. The economy is just going to completely dollarize. They are going to start taxing purchases in U.S. dollars, the government, so that they can get more revenue, because the oil is not enough for them. And I see it staying like that in the long term, like Cuba, right? Living as a parasite economy of remittances from family members abroad.
So the people in Venezuela will be reliant on family members who live in places like the United States to subsidize their lifestyles.
That's right. From, people in the United States, from people in Colombia, in Peru, in Spain, Italy. And the sad thing about that is that even though they might eat and they might have enough money to eat because of those remittances, they won't have enough money to progress, right? They won't be able to start their own businesses. They won't be able to have meaningful jobs that allows them to get richer and have better quality of life. It's just going to stagnate.
When you talk to your friends, what are their dreams for their futures?
Leaving the country. That's the dream in Venezuela, right? Emigrating and going to a place where you can actually build a dream.
Well, I know that you were able to obtain a bachelor's degree with honors in quantitative economics in December of 2019. So what's next for you? What are your plans for your career and your life?
Well, right now I'm working at the Institute for the Study of Free Enterprise in the University of Kentucky. I'm also working with an organization that we're launching our website soon, which is called Dissident.
Could you spell your website's URL out?
Yeah, Dissident. It is DISSIDENT.com. And we show the stories of people who live under authoritarian governments. And we also expose those who promote those kinds of ideas in the United States, both left, right, but especially focusing on people from socialist countries. And we think it's important because the United States is a country of immigrants. Many immigrants in the United States have fled socialist countries, not just Venezuelans, Cubans, and Nicaraguans, but also people from the Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union and even China and North Korea, Vietnam. So many people in the United States have come from there. And I think that our voices are important into keeping this a free nation. And it's also our duty as immigrants to this country to keep this nation free.
Daniel DiMartino, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Tim.
To learn more about Daniel DiMartino and everything we talked about today, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please help others find it. Leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to follow Daniel DiMartino, you can follow Daniel on Twitter. Just look for Daniel DiMartino. It's DanielDiMartino on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook page, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.